Greetings, folks, and welcome to another edition of Facebook Live and History Up Close at the National Naval Aviation Museum. I'm Museum Director Sterling Gillum, and today we highlight our NC-4 flying boat and his historic crossing of the Atlantic 100 years ago last May. It's one of the few airplanes in our collection that we actually don't own outright. It is on loan to us from the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., and we're very fortunate for that. And we're also very fortunate to have with us today Captain Tim Kinsella, call sign Lucky, the commanding officer of Naval Air Station Pensacola, to tell us about NC-4 and its unique relationship to this wonderful base here at Pensacola. Lucky, take it away.
Thank you, Sterls. Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be here with you, and let me tell you what a privilege it is here to be standing here in front of this amazing aircraft. A lot of aviation enthusiasts, aviation critics call this an ugly duckling. They call it an unsightly, unseemly, ungainly thing that isn't supposed to fly. But as Admiral Conway said in 1969, when the Smithsonian had its 50th anniversary of this ship, that the beauty is in the eye of the guy that's flying the thing if it actually completes its mission. And let me tell you, this aircraft completed its mission. To me, this is one of the most beautiful things with wings you'd ever seen. So before we start this, I'm going to give you two questions to see who's paying attention to what we're talking about here. See if you can answer it on Facebook. So the first one is, there are three aircraft in this wonderful collection we have here. There's the NC-4. Over there, on the other side of the museum, we've got a B-25 Mitchell, and there's an SBT-2 Dauntless. What have those three aircraft got in common? And the next thing is, what do I have in common with this aircraft? So think about it, give me your answers on Facebook Live, and we'll talk about it when we're done. So first thing we're going to talk about is, we're going to talk about the aircraft itself, just about its dimensions, how it got its start, why it was built, and so forth. Then we'll talk about the crew, those magnificent men in that flying machine that went across the Atlantic for the first time in May of 1919. And then lastly, we'll talk about the actual trip, what happened during that amazing, they started on the 7th of May and they finished on the 28th of May, I believe it was. So during that time, that amazing trip that they had going across the Atlantic. So first, how did it come about? How did this NC-4 come about? Well, NC, first of all, it stands for N for Navy, C for Curtiss, and 4 because it was the fourth in a class of 4 flying boats. So during World War I, there was a need for anti-submarine warfare aircraft to protect the convoys going across the Atlantic. Have a step back for a minute. Before World War I, there was the Daily Mail had put a prize money up for £10,000, which is over $1 million in today's money, for a prize for the first aircraft that would fly across the Atlantic, and they had to do it within 72 hours. So Commander John Towers, who's one of our first naval aviators, got with Glenn Curtiss, and they came up with an idea to create an aircraft that was going to do that. Glenn Curtiss built it. It was called the America, and it was painted red. It looked something like this. It had 3 engines. Beautiful thing. But then what happened in 1914? World War I. So during World War I, America enters 1917, and now we got to figure out a way to hunt submarines. So the United States Navy put together a team to design an aircraft along with Glenn Curtiss, because he had experience in doing it, and they came up with this design here. So there's some things that are pretty special about it that I'm going to talk about. And then after the war, the question of that prize from the Daily Mail came up again. Well, John Towers decided, you know what? What a wonderful way, after World War I, with the United States Navy, we can show our prestige and our technical know-how, and wouldn't it be great for the country if we were the first ones to do that? We're not after it for the prize money, we're after it for our national honor and the prestige of the great United States Navy. So, after the war, they came up with this design, and there's a couple of things that are very special about it that I want to show you. So first is, look in here, you can see the wingspan. It's a pretty darn big wingspan. It's 126 feet across. So think about this. The Wright brothers, their first flight was, General, how long was it? 112 feet. So the first manned flight was less than the wingspan of this aircraft. And by the way, the wingspan and the wing area of this aircraft is about the size of a 737. So it's pretty amazing. So you see the engines. We've got 4 of the engines. 4 engines here. We'll get a closer look at them when we get up top. They are Victory V12 water-cooled engines. And there's 3 what they call tractor engines. The tractors mean that they're pulling the aircraft. And then the middle one has behind it a pusher engine. So there's 4 engines, each 400 horsepower for a total of 1,200 horsepower. So as we walk around here, we'll just keep on walking around. The hull itself is made from Sitka spruce, it's made from mahogany, and it's made from ash. So the spruce was the planking, and the hull was actually made, this plane was made by several different companies. Curtis came up and the Navy team came up with a design, but it took a lot of different companies to actually build the aircraft. And the hull was made by the Hershoff company. They built America's Cup boats in the 1800s and early 1900s. And they're from Bristol, Rhode Island, and they're still around today. So it's pretty amazing. So this aircraft was actually built mostly by boat builders. The wings were built, of course, by an aircraft manufacturing company, but the rest of it was done mostly by boat builders. So as we walk around, this hull is very special. This hull, it's called a reverse curve hull. It was designed by Commander Richardson, which was part of that first group that were trying to design this aircraft. And it's special in that this hull, it became the standard for all flying boats afterwards. Helicopter I used to fly had a hull very similar to that. So as we keep on walking back here, we're going to kind of squeeze in here. You can see up there on the nose, and we'll get a better look at that. This was, as I said, it was designed for anti-submarine warfare. So up there was supposed to be a Lewis gunner. The Lewis gunner would sit so he could shoot the submarines, of course. So as we move around here, come on in. So all these spars here and at the tail, this tail is important. We're going to talk about this tail a little bit later on. But these spars were built, and I got to look this up because it's a funny old name. They were Norwegian Hollow Spar Company, and they were a company that built spars and masts. And so again, this is mostly built by folks who are building boats and ships, not aircraft. If we look over here on the hull, you can see the step. Just about every flying boat after this had this step, and again, this was designed by Commander Richardson, and this allowed the hull of the boat to break free from that friction on the water as it was taking off, so it would take less power for the aircraft to take off. And that was a significant issue with flying boats up until this wonderful aircraft. The tail boom, as you can see, is just made from these spars right here, and you have this massive tail structure here. Now the reason for that is twofold. First is that it's saved on weight. Actually, it's threefold. First, it's saved on weight. Secondly, during rough seas, the tail boom is raised up out of the water, so it's not getting in the way of the water. So it's less surface area on the ocean. And then lastly, another Lewis machine gunner would be set up here in the back of the hull, and that enabled him to shoot down onto the enemies. Now, if we come around here, now these engines, they were had to be fed by fuel, and the engines are up there pretty high. So where's the fuel tanks? The fuel tanks are actually in the hull. They're big, huge drums that were there in the hull. And the fuel, you can see these little propellers. I don't know if you can see them up there. You see them? Yeah? Okay, these propellers, wind-driven, and then they would drive pumps that would pump the fuel up to the top of the engines, and it was gravity-fed down into the engines. Pretty cool stuff. The wings were all covered by fabric, by linen. There's a clue to one of the questions. I'm not going to give it away to you, though. And then we're going to go, let's move forward here. We're going to go up. It's not very often people get to see this. I'm excited. I hope you are too. Okay, we're going to be careful not to touch it here because this is over a 100-year-old aircraft. So here's a good view of what the crew would see when they're up here. So let's talk about how they flew. How did they fly in this thing? If you can have a look at the seats down there. So the total flight time going across the Atlantic from New York all the way over to Plymouth was 52 hours. Can you imagine sitting in these seats for 52 hours? And if you look down there in the cockpit, it wasn't a stick, it was like a steering wheel for a bus. And if you look at their instruments, it's kind of hard to see, but the only instruments that they had was they had an airspeed indicator, they had an inclinometer and a for a pitchometer, and then, which is very, very rudimentary, and then they had the compass just up top. All those other instruments that you see were for the engines. So not very ergonomic, not compared to the cockpits you had today. If you're a pilot, you can imagine trying to do an instrument scan with your compass up here, and then your pitch and roll which by the way, the roll only went to 10 degrees, the pitch only down to 20 degrees, and then your airspeed's way down low. So kind of tough to fly in those conditions. Plus you got the pelting rain, you got the wind, and so forth. So up front here on the nose, that's where the navigator sat, right up here. Now there's no room for him to get down underneath and crawl back here, so he has to walk along this gangplank, this walkway right along here. Then you have the pilot and the co-pilot, and there are two engineers, and there was a radio operator, and they would be down inside the hull. And there's a hatch just right here where they would go down inside the hull. Now I'm no expert on this plane. I love it. It's wonderful. It's great. But I'll tell you what, that's quite a feat to fly this thing. And if you could imagine, they're flying at nighttime, they're flying in fog, they're flying over rough seas, pretty heavy winds. I mean, that's quite a feat of airmanship. So let's head back down. Let's meet the crew. So the aircraft itself, it weighed about 18,000 pounds, and that was fully unloaded. And then with a full tank of gas, its full crew, it was about 28,000 pounds. So that's quite a lot of weight. It flew at about 85 knots. That was its max speed. Doesn't mean it's going to fly that all the time. So if you're flying across the Atlantic, winds can get pretty heavy out there. So you got a 30 knot headwind, then you're only doing about 50 knots. So that's pretty slow. You're almost standing still. So let's meet the crew. Right here, we've got Ensign Herbert C. Rudd. He was the radio officer, and he was very key. He was a key player in getting this aircraft across the Atlantic. Follow me. Over here, here's Commander John Towers. He was kind of the brainchild behind all of this. He went on to be a 4-star admiral. He was eventually, after the war, became Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, and he was one of our first aviators. There he is, right there, sitting in the front of the aircraft. How you doing there, John? Over here, we've got Lieutenant Elmer Stone, United States Coast Guard. So all our coasties, oops, sorry there, Elmer. All our coasties out there, shout out to those guys. He was Coast Guard Aviator #1, got his wings right here in Pensacola. And then later this year, we're supposed to commission the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Stone after Elmer Stone. So looking forward to that. Over here, Walter L. Hinton. He was a co-pilot. So Elmer Stone and Walter Hinton were the two pilots that were flying this wonderful aircraft. Here is the wee fella himself, Lieutenant Commander A.C. Reed, the commander of this aircraft. His call sign or nickname was Putty, because his classmates at the Naval Academy called him that, because he had a very unemotional face, and they said his face looked like putty. So this is Putty. Not Putty from Seinfeld, this is the original Putty. And over here, we've got Chief Machinist Mate Eugene S. Rhodes. He was the engineer. So he didn't have his wings yet, but he became an enlisted pilot, and he became a very successful pilot, actually. And right here, lastly, we've got Lieutenant James L. Brees, who was the engineering officer. These two guys were responsible for keeping those engines running and getting that aircraft across the Atlantic. And trust me, it took a lot of coaxing, a lot of babying to get those engines running and purring like kittens. And boy, did they do it. So let's talk about the event itself, how this aircraft got across the Atlantic, what happened to it when it got across, and with its the other three boats. So as I said, this is NC-4, so that means there must be 4, right? NC-1, 2, 3, 4. Well, actually, NC-2 was used to cannibalize parts for NC-1 and NC-3. So we'll talk about that for a minute. In May of 1919, all 3 aircraft, or 4 aircraft actually, they assembled up in Rockaway, New York. It's just there in Long Island. And as they got ready to prepare the aircrafts, a lot of sort of accidents started happening. First, I had to write them down because there's so many of them. The first one, NC-1, was damaged during a storm. It was at anchor in Jamaica Bay, just out there in New York, and part of the ring was ripped off. Who was commanding NC, who was the commander of the seaplane flotilla, which is what they call it, seaplane division is what they call it at the time. He said, why don't you cannibalize NC-2 and then we could fix NC-1? So they did. Then a couple of days later in May, there was a hangar fire. They were trying to refuel NC-1. There was a hangar fire, and it burned off another part of a wing. So again, they cannibalized NC-2 to put a new wing onto NC-1. The day before they were supposed to leave, on May 7th, the maintenance chief, Edward Howard, who Rhodes replaced, was working on the pusher engine, the 4th As he was working on it, he misjudged his distance from the engine and the propeller took off his hand. So that's when Chief Machinist Mate Rhodes replaced him at the last minute. So on May 8th, right there at NAS Rockaway, the 3 planes together, we had Commander John Towers, who was an NC-1. We had, what was his name, Ridgway, who was in NC-3. And then we had AC Reed, who's in NC-4. And as they take off from Rockaway Bay, they take off into the sunset, so it's just getting dark. Now the reason they take off in dark is because these flights took so long that they wanted to land when it was during daytime. And by the way, if you look just on the nose of the aircraft, you see 2 little doohickeys there, and they were actually flares, where if they had to land at night, right before they landed, they would shoot those flares off electronically so they give them a place where they could land. So the plan was they would go from Rockaway, I can find my notes here. Yeah, they would go from Rockaway, New York to Halifax, which is about 540 miles. Then they'd go from Halifax to Tripathy Bay, which is up in Newfoundland. That was about 460 miles. Then they'd go from Tripathy Bay up in Newfoundland to Horta in the Azores, right across the Atlantic, which is about 1,200 miles. Then from Horta, they would go a very short flight to Porto Delgado in the Azores again. And then from Porto Delgado, they go to Lisbon, 800 miles, and from Lisbon finally they'd go to Plymouth, which is about 755 miles. To get there, if we just come back over here with me again. So this was a big deal for the Navy. The Navy put as much effort into this almost as the United States government and NASA did into the moon landings in 1969. This was a massive effort. National pride was at stake. The pride of the United States Navy was at stake, so no expenses were spared. There was a lot of firsts in this aircraft. They had intercom communications for the first time. The radios were the top of the line, the most advanced radios that they had at the time. So this was a technological and a design and engineering marvel when they first built it. So to get these aircraft across, they didn't have GPS, they didn't have TACAN, they only had direction finding equipment where if a ship were to send out a radio signal, they'd use their radio to point the way. So what they did was they took 23 ships, and these 23 picket ships went all the way, you can see here, all the way from Newfoundland, all the way down here, all the way to the Azores, and then from the Azores, all the way over to Lisbon, and then from Lisbon, all the way up here to Plymouth. And all these ships were between 50 to 60 miles apart. On these ships, surprisingly or interestingly, 3 of these ships were commanded, one by a fellow named Bull Halsey, one was commanded by a fellow named Raven Spruance, another one was commanded by a fellow named Frank Jack Fletcher. So when you think you had Mitcher in one of the aircraft, you had Frank Jack Fletcher, you had Bull Halsey, and you had Raven Spruance, all part of this, and they were pretty big names in naval aviation or Navy history, as I'm sure you'll recognize. So they take off from Rockaway Bay to head up to Halifax into the night, and NC-1 and NC-3, they make it up there no problem, but NC-4, she has a bit of a problem. First, she loses 2 engines, so she has to make a landing in the water at nighttime. They land and then they taxi 250 miles up to Chatham in Massachusetts. They get the engines replaced. NC-1 and NC-3 are in Halifax, and then they decide that they're going to keep on going up. They have to. One of them NC-1 has to have her propellers replaced because they got cracks. So they go up to Tripathy Bay, and they don't know where NC-4 is. They're up in Tripathy Bay, and they think, you know what, we're going to leave NC-4 if they don't show up in time, and we're going to leave by ourselves. So poor AC Reed and the rest of his crew, they're trying to make it. They get their engines fixed when they're in Chatham, and then they take off again into the night, and then they have more problems. And then they have to land again, but eventually they make it in into Tripathy Bay. Luckily for them, they thought AC Reed was going to go without, John Towers was going to go without them. As they are landing up in Tripathy Bay, they see NC-1 and NC-3 trying to take off to go, but the bad weather prevented them from doing so. Weather next day was supposed to be much better and a full moon, so they decided to wait till the next day. NC-4 got refueled, did some small repairs, so they take off into the night, into a beautiful moonlit night. And again, they have to take off at nighttime so they can land during daytime. First 8 hours go okay. However, NC-3's navigation lights weren't working too well. And also all 3 aircraft, they're not like modern design standards, so they all had different flight characteristics. The NC-4 flew faster, the NC-1 flew slower, so they had to break up. As the sun is rising, what comes with that but fog? I mean, bad fog, really bad fog. So they lose their way from the ships. They can't see the ships anymore. John Towers had to ditch his radio from Tripathy Bay because he was too heavy. So he had no way to transmit, he could only receive. He sees a ship, he thinks it's one of the picket ships, so he goes down towards it. Turns out it's not, it's just a random ship coming across the Atlantic, the USS Marblehead. So he's running out of gas. We'll get back to him in a minute. So A.C. Reed, he also loses sight of the ships, but using dead reckoning, he figures the Azores is this way. So he heads out that way. The fog is so bad that when A.C. Reed is in the nose of the aircraft, he can't see the wings. So imagine that. You're flying over the ocean, middle of the Atlantic Ocean, about 2,000 feet. It's raining, there's wind, there's fog. You can't even see where the wings are in the aircraft because the fog is so bad. The fog got so bad and they got so disoriented that Hinton put the aircraft almost into a spin. Now, if you're a pilot and you get into a spin at 2,000 feet, it's not very long before you hit terra firma, or the water in this case. Luckily, they pulled it out and they got the aircraft back flying straight and level. The radio operator, he was one of the best radio operators in the Navy, and he was able to triangulate and get a good fix to get them back to the Azores. So they did. They get to the Azores, they land in the bay, they see Horta Bay. It had just cleared up enough for him to land, and right when he lands there, he doesn't see any of the other NCs, and the fog comes crashing in, comes rolling in. He then lands and he says, well, where are the other guys? Well, it turns out John Towers had landed the NC-3 to try and get a fix because he was running out of fuel. But the water was so bad, the water was so rough that it almost ripped off half of the wing. The fabric was ripped off, one of the struts had collapsed. So he then had to essentially sail the boat 250 miles from where he was in those rough seas all the way back to all the way to the Azores. And they sailed it backwards. And they used that massive tail boom that we looked at earlier on as his sail. So using expert seamanship and navigation, he managed to use the currents and the wind and using that tail section to sail this, essentially now a boat, all the way into Horta Bay. And then the other one, which was commanded or with Mitcher on it, they had to land, but then they couldn't take off, and they were picked up by a Greek merchant vessel, the Ionia. So then after they were in the Azores, and then A.C. Reed assumed that Towers was going to again take command of the flight, but Secretary Daniels says, no way, Jose, Towers, you're staying there, and then A.C. Reed is going to take it all the way, because the press had taken to calling this boat the lame duck, because it kept on breaking down. So Josephus Daniels, the Secretary of the Navy, thought, wouldn't it be a great story if A.C. Reed took this all the way to Lisbon? So they took off into the night again, and then early on the morning of May 27th, the evening of May 27th, right as the sun was starting to set, they're following those picket ships, and every picket ship, as they're going over it, they're radioing back saying, yep, we got them. Next one, yep, we got them. They're on their way. Get to the last picket ship, and what do they see? This glimmering, flickering light out in the distance, which is the lighthouse at Punta del Roca, which is the Lisbon coast. And right then, A.C. Reed knows we've made it. We've done it. No matter what happens, even if we crash, we've made it. And when they landed, that was the first ever flight across the Atlantic. A couple of days later, then they went up to Plymouth and they got a hero's welcome. Even the King of England gave them a jolly well done. So this, ladies and gentlemen, in my view, set the standard for naval aviators for the entire century, up to this point. It set the standard of professionalism, it set the standard of mission accomplishment, it set our ethos, the type of things that we aspire to as naval aviators. These are the men that paved the way for us. And I gotta tell you, it's a privilege for me to stand here and just even talk to you about it. Now, I'm no expert on this, but I'll answer whatever questions I can. So all you folks out there on Facebook, what do you got?
So we've got a question from Mr. Gray Morrison. He says, can you explain the propulsion system of 3 pulling 2-blade propellers and 1 pushing 4-blade on the center engine? What is that all about?
That's a good one. Well, they all started out being 4-bladed propellers, and they were actually revolutionary propellers. They were designed specifically for this aircraft, but they started developing cracks. So there's so much stress on those pulling propellers. They started cracking, so they switched them out for Navy standard issue 2-bladed propellers, but the pusher had less stress on it, so they were able to leave that 4-bladed, as I understand it.
So Rock the Sky asks, can you tell me where the radio communication set with the propeller was located and if it's still on the plane today?
Well, I haven't gotten inside the plane myself, because if I did, the Smithsonian would have a few words to say to me about it. However, the propellers are right back there where we talked about the propellers that worked the fuel pumps. The propeller for it was back there, and the radio set was down inside the hull, which is where the 2 engineers and a radio operator would have been.
Jim Cassett asks, I believe 10 of these planes were built. How many of them survive today?
This is the only surviving one, and this is, they call these boats Nancy's, NC Nancy's. Of this class, this particular one, there was only 4 built, and this is the only one surviving.
So we have a message from a teacher at Sims Elementary School here in Pensacola, Florida. She says, good morning, my name is Mrs. Dublin, and I'm a teacher at Sims Elementary School in Pensacola. My 4th grade class and I will be watching your virtual tour. My students have been working so hard with learning and completing their assignments virtually, but they have also really stepped it up with helping their parents at home. They are just amazing kiddos. Could you please give them some words of encouragement before you end your virtual tour?
Oh, you betcha. Words of encouragement. I mean, come to Pensacola, first of all. Come to Pensacola and see this amazing museum. Because if you want to be inspired, to be something better than yourself, if you want to be inspired to make the most of your life, come here and see what the amazing men and women of the United States Navy and Marine Corps have done with naval aviation. Let me tell you, show you something here, kids. So this is why I love this museum. Standing right here, we have this aircraft that flew in 1919, which was the first one to fly across the Atlantic. In the same, with just moving my head a couple of degrees right up there, you can't see it from with it's kind of dark up there, but is the capsule from the Skylab mission in 1975, I think. So, but that capsule is very similar to the moon landing for Apollo 11. So standing right here, in one span, I can see where naval aviation as a whole went. It went from this biplane going across the Atlantic in 1919 to 50 years later, man walking on the moon. The technological achievement it took for us to do that is pretty much the same as what it took for us to land on the moon. It was the same amount of national effort that took us to do that, but look what we did. Look what we did for the furtherment of aviation and the furtherment of mankind. And that's what you can do, each one of you.
So Mrs. Dublin's students have a few questions for you. They say, what is the max speed of the NC-4?
It is 85 miles an hour, which is about 75 knots, 76 knots.
And what's the highest altitude it can reach?
So its ceiling was 2,000 feet, but it could go higher than that if it really wanted to. What really limited it and how high it could go was the power of the engines, because the higher the aircraft would go, the harder the engines have to work because the air is less dense. And also, the higher you get, what happens? It gets cold and chilly. So they don't want to get too high. In fact, A.C. Reed, he was talking at Harvard University, and he was giving a lecture after this flight, and he said to the crowd, you know, one day, aircraft are going to fly at 60,000 feet and go 1,000 miles an hour. And he was ridiculed in the press. They called him a fool. They said, how could you do that? People would freeze at that altitude. No way an aircraft could go 1,000 miles an hour. Well, guess what? They did it less than 50 years after this flight.
Scott Brumfield says, tell us again about the engineer that lost his hand the day before they took off.
Well, all I can tell you about him is that he lost his hand. And he didn't, I think he was right-handed, so he had to learn how to write left-handed. But he was an engineer, he was a chief machinist mate, and he was standing right up there just forward of that propeller, and they were working on the engine, and he was trying to work on a piece of the engine that was close to where the propeller was, and he stuck his hand out and he misjudged the distance, and it got rid of his hand. There's actually another accident where another engineer, when they were doing their cross-country public affairs tour, he fell into one of the propellers and he lost his arm, his leg was crushed, and his head was split open, but he survived. So he had two pretty nasty injuries on this aircraft.
Andrea Hindsight says, how long was it used, and can you tell us the wingspan again?
Sure, the wingspan is 126 feet, and the Wright brothers flew only, General? 112 feet. What happened to the aircraft?
How long was it used?
Okay, so when they came back from that amazing flight across the Atlantic, then they did a public affairs tour. They went all around mostly the southeastern and eastern United States and some in the Midwest. Of course, they didn't use airports, they used rivers as their runways. And they did that through 1920. Then in 1920, it was the Smithsonian, I think actually the Navy. The Navy took it, the Smithsonian took the hull, and the Navy took the wings. And it wasn't until many years later that one of the members of the crew of one of the other boats was actually the commander-in-chief of surface forces in the Atlantic station there in Norfolk. And one of the Smithsonian curators was looking for the wings, couldn't find them anywhere, heard that they were in Norfolk, so talked to the commander-in-chief of Atlantic Fleet, or the Atlantic Surface Forces at that time during World War II, said, yeah, we got them, they're in this hangar here in Norfolk, and we're going to destroy them here pretty soon. My goodness, we can't do that. So the Smithsonian took them all and put them in a warehouse. It was put together and it was displayed at various places on the mall, right down there by Washington Monument. It was displayed for a while. 1969, they went back into storage. 1969, they put it together again. They spent about 6 months putting it together, and they brought it back out to the mall. It stayed in the mall for a month. They had a big ceremony for the 50th anniversary. The last surviving member of the crew, Chief Rhodes, he came out and was there for the celebration. Pretty amazing. And then in 1975, it was given to loaned to the Naval Aviation Museum because it's such a big part of our history.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. This one comes from Keith Jambura. Did they cruise on all 4 engines, or could they fly on 2 or 3?
They cruised on all 4 engines. They needed as much power as they could get. I think they could cruise on 3, but no, if they lost an engine, they'd be going down and doing their having to replace another engine. So it's not like modern planes, like if you're a P3 guy where you're shutting an engine down to save some gas. They needed all 4 of those babies. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us today. Captain, come here. What a rare treat. What a rare treat to have the captain, the commanding officer of the Air Base, here with us to tell the story of this iconic aircraft and this historic mission. My name is Dwayne Thiessen. I'm the president and CEO of the Naval Aviation Museum Foundation, and each week we want to bring you a new presentation that I think you're going to find exciting. We have a whole series of them lined up, but this coming Thursday at 11 o'clock, we want to bring you Marty Marshall, who's going to talk to you about launch operations. So I invite you to join us on Thursday, 11 o'clock, for Facebook History Up Close here in the National Naval Aviation Museum. Thank you.